Hello, everybody, and today I am joined by a legend. He is the writer of course, the 1981 book Who Censored Roger Rabbit, which of course became Who Framed Roger Rabbit in 1988, and then he even wrote two more books after that. But of course, this is I guess we could call you the father of Roger Rabbit. Is that correct?
I think father, creator, yeah, that's great. That's great. I like to refer to myself as the almighty, exalted, grand potentate of Toontown, but you can call me whatever you want. Actually, I don't care.
Yeah, that's great. The mayor of Toontown.
The mayor of Toontown would be good, although I think Porky Pig holds that distinction, but I might run against him in the next election. I don't know. I haven't decided.
That's great. Well, that's great. So welcome to the show, Gary.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Yeah, and so, I mean, what better way to start the podcast than getting, the creator? So let's go back to...
So some might say you're starting at the bottom and there's no way to go from up with me as your first guest. I don't know, but I'll leave that to you after you've heard what I have to say.
I think quite the opposite, in fact, but let's start with, I guess, the beginning. How did you get into writing? Was it reading comics? Was your inspiration? Where did the inspiration for your passion for writing begin?
Yeah. To answer that, you have to go back to my childhood, and you have to kind of know a little bit about where I came from and how I grew up. I grew up on a little farm town in Illinois called Earlville, 1,400 people. I didn't live on a farm. I lived in the city. My father ran the pool hall in that town, and my mother worked in the school cafeteria. But basically a small town. And the first time that I can remember, being interested in creativity, I was given, I was in the second or third grade, I can't remember, whatever grade you are when you do this kind of stuff. And my teacher gave everybody in the class a picture to color. And the whole point of this exercise was to stay inside the lines. That was the whole point. Now, I was better at staying inside the lines than anybody. I mean, I could stay inside the lines forever, so I didn't think this was going to be much of a challenge for me. So I took that picture home, got out my crayons, and looked at that picture, and the picture showed a typical farm scene. There was a farmhouse, there was a barn, there was a fence, there was a meadow, and there was a cow out all by itself in the middle of the meadow. So I colored the farmhouse yellow, which is the color that farmhouses were around Earlville. I colored the barn red, colored the grass green, the fence brown. I mean, stayed inside the lines. Perfect. Then I come to the cow, and looking at that cow all by itself out in the middle of that field. And my mother had always told me that when people were by themselves, that they sometimes got sad, they got lonely, and they got blue. And I'm looking at that poor, lonely, sad cow out there. I colored the cow blue. So I turned the picture in the next day, and the day after that, the teacher handed all those pictures back to everybody except me. And she said, Gary, would you come up here to the front of the class? I said, oh, my God, I stayed inside the lines better than anybody. I'm getting called out here for special attention. She said, no, face the class. I faced the class, and I'm all smiles. And she held that picture up over my head, and she said, class, look at this stupid picture. She said, everybody knows cows are brown, cows are black, cows are white. Sometimes cows are brown, black, and white all together. Never are cows blue. That just never happens. She said, Gary, don't you ever do anything like that again. She called my mother. My mother had to go to school and talk to the teacher. I mean, this was a big deal for my mother. And the teacher said, I think there's something wrong with Gary. I think that he might have to see a psychiatrist. There's something wrong with him. So that night, my mother and my father called me into the living room. And they asked me, why did you color that cow blue? And I said, but Ma, it was you. You were the one who told me, people get sand lonely, they get blue. Cow was sand lonely, I called the cow blue. So my mother and father said, go outside, play for a while. We have to talk about this. Now, you have to understand my mother and my father. As I say, my father ran the pool hall. My mother worked in the school cafeteria. My father had to drop out of school in the third grade to go to work during the Depression. My mother had to drop out of school in the eighth grade to go to work during the Depression. So these were not what you would call today upscale urban liberals. I mean, these were hard scrabble working folk with minimal education, but a lot of common sense. And I really didn't expect that this was going to have a happy ending for me. I did not really think that would happen. So after a while, my mother called me back in, and she sat me down, and she said, Gary, she said, your father and I talked about this, and we talked about what you said and what you told us, and we've decided that the next time you want to color a cow blue, you go ahead and color a cow blue. So my mother called the teacher and said, hey, look, we talked about this, and let him do whatever he wants. Oh, we don't have a problem with that. So about 2 weeks later, the teacher gave us another assignment, and this time she said, I want you to write what you did on your summer vacation. So everybody was writing about how I went up to the Wisconsin Dells, or I went to Starved Rock, or I stayed home, or whatever. So I wrote a little one-page story about how I went out in my backyard and I built a rocket ship out of aluminum foil and tin cans, and I flew to the moon. And the teacher gave it back to me and said, well, that was interesting. And so that whole scenario, that was the first time that anybody validated my creativity. I mean, they told me that the way I saw the world was not strange, that it was kind of interesting and kind of enjoyable. And I mean, since then, I've gone on to color a whole lot of cows blue. But how I got into Roger Rabbit, again, it comes from my mother, a good, practical, level-headed woman. My mother told me when I was little, just when I was able to read, my mother said, look, if you want to get out of this town, you want to leave this town, and you don't want to wind up staying here the rest of your life and running your father's pool hall. You want to make something better of yourself. The one thing you can do to make that happen is to read. Just read, and that will get you out of this town. So I did. I mean, I read. But I mean, what did I read? Well, I read what kids read. I read comic books. I read comic books and saw cartoons at the one movie theater in town. And the other thing I read was something that my father read. My father read something which in that era, this is the late 40s, early 50s, in that era, they called true crime magazines. And these were magazines that had stories about true crimes. I mean, graphic murders, all kinds of horrible stuff. And these stories were illustrated with photographs of the actual crime scene. Now, if you ever saw a movie called Road to Perdition with Tom Hanks, Jude Law played a photographer who took these kinds of pictures. And my dad read them because, he liked them. And they were all over the house, so I read them too. And again, my mother, good woman that she was, never once said, Gary, don't read that stuff, it'll rot your brain. She encouraged me to read whatever. Luckily, I finally discovered a better quality of crime story. Dashiell Hammett and Ross McDonald, Mike Hammer stories, John D. McDonald, and I got an appreciation and a love for noir mysteries. So this is kind of where Roger Rabbit came from. I had written a ton of short stories. I wrote a novel. Doubleday bought it and gave me a contract for 3 more novels. So they gave me a 4-book deal, and I could write whatever I wanted to for those 4 books. So I wrote the first novel was called Killer Bowl. The second one was called A Generation Removed. The third one was called A Resurrectionist. They were all science fiction. For the fourth one, I wanted to do something different, something unique, something that nobody had ever done before. I wanted to push the envelope, really, stretch the boundaries. I wanted to write a book that dealt with cartoons, comic books, and detectives, hard-boiled detectives. Now, that's a concept that's easier said than done. I mean, how do you put all that stuff together? So I was watching Saturday morning cartoons one Saturday morning, and I became taken not with the cartoons themselves, which were pretty rough and unrealistic, but I became taken with the commercials, because I saw cartoon characters. I saw the Trix Rabbit and Captain Crunch and Tony the Tiger and Snap, Crackle, and Pop, cartoon characters talking to real kids, and nobody seemed to think that was odd. And I thought to myself, what an interesting premise that would be for a novel. What if you had a world where cartoon characters were real? What kind of a world would that be? So I spent a year researching the kinds of things that go on in comic books and cartoons that would be kind of odd in a human world. Came up with a bunch of them, of course, and then came up with my hero, who was Eddie Valiant. I named him after my father as a kind of an homage to those true crime magazines he let me read when I was a kid. I put together a story that would only work, only work in a world where cartoon characters were real. It wouldn't work in a world of only humans. So, and I wrote the book. It took me another year. Finished it in late 1979 and sent it to Doubleday. I said, hey, here's the fourth book in my 4-book deal. Now, they kept it for a while, and I mean, I'd written, a ton of short stories and 3 novels. Never had a reject. They sent it back and said, we reject it. We can't publish this. And first reject I'd never had in my life as a writer. So I called my editor. I said, Sharon, why did you reject this? And she said, well, it was clearly the best thing you've ever written. And she said it was funny, insightful, totally groundbreaking, but it was so different from anything that you've ever written, so different from anything anybody's ever written, that I had to send it to the marketing department, and they were the ones who rejected it. So I called the marketing department, head of the marketing department. I said, Charlie, why did you reject my book? He said, we all thought it was really hilarious and a really, really interesting book, but he said, we can't sell this book. There's no category for this on the bookstore shelves. It's not a regular fiction novel. It's not a children's novel. It's not really fantasy. It's not really science fiction. There's no category for it. There's no place we can put it on the bookstore shelf. We can't sell this book. So I said to him, what would you do if somebody today gave you Alice in Wonderland or Gulliver's Travels or The Wizard of Oz? What would you do with those? And he thought for a minute and said, we couldn't sell those either. So I went to my agent and I said, Bill, what's going to happen here? Because if I can't publish this, I don't want to be a writer anymore. I mean, this is what I want to write. I love writing this book, and this is what I want to write. He said, oh, don't worry, we'll find someplace. So he started sending it out to different publishers, different editors at the same publisher, and it kept getting rejected, always for the same reason. The editors loved it. They sent it to the marketing department. Marketing department said, we can't sell this book. So my wife at that period, they used to get rejects in those days by mail. They came in a letter. And my wife used to call my trip out to the mailbox every day the daily disappointments, because I'd come back with 2, 3, sometimes 4 rejects. And along the way, Roger was rejected 110 times. 110 different companies rejected Roger Rabbit. And then one day, 111th time, it landed on the desk of a woman named Rebecca St. Martin, and she was an editor at St. Martin's Press. She was no relation to the St. Martin from St. Martin's Press, just a coincidence. But Rebecca read the novel, and she had just done a big bestseller for St. Martin's. So they gave her a vanity project. They said, all right, the next book that you see that you really want to publish, we'll publish it. You know, it's our thank you for editing and finding a big bestseller for us. So Roger Rabbit came across her desk, and of course she was taken with it. She went to the head of St. Martin's and said, here's the book I want to publish, my vanity project. Here it is. He said, well, okay, I'm going to take it home. I'm going to read it tonight, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. So he took it home, read it that night, came back the next day and called her into the office and said, Rebecca, I told you could publish anything you wanted, but you can't publish this because I can't sell it. And Rebecca stepped up to the plate and said, you told me I could publish anything? Either publish this or I quit. And by golly, they published it. Very small quantities. And if I had it all to do over again, people always ask me, well, would you do any part of your life over? If you could relive your life, what would you do differently? If I could relive my life and do something differently, I would go back in time and I would buy all of those copies. 5,000 copies, they sold for $2.99. If you're lucky today on eBay, you could find one for under $400. So I would have gone back and bought them all and put them in a barn somewhere. But that's how I started to write it, and that's how it got published.
Wow, that's a great story. It fascinates me. You were willing to, quit being a writer to get this book published. You mentioned your 3 previous books. I'm curious, when you wrote Who Censored Roger Rabbit, how satisfied were you with your career, with where you were going? When you wrote this book, did you feel when you were making it that this would be your best work? I mean, it's your most famous work. How do you feel it's the best thing you've written?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I've never gotten that before. But 2 things. In Disney pop culture circles, Who Censored Roger Rabbit and the whole Roger Rabbit milieu is my most famous work. If I go to a science fiction conference, Killer Bolt is what I'm known for. I'm known as the guy that wrote Killer Bolt. That's the book that I wrote first. It's still my favorite of those 3 science fiction novels. And that's the book that I'm really well known for in science fiction circles. I had a pretty good career going with Killer Bolt, A Generation Removed, and The Resurrectionist. I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area. I was pretty well known as a science fiction writer there. I would go to book signings and autographings and the local science fiction conventions, and I would be not a celebrity on the level of Harlan Ellison or Robert Silverberg, but I was well known and I was well respected in the field. I loved Roger Rabbit. When I wrote Roger Rabbit, I would just immerse myself in it, and it was so much fun for me, and I had so much fun writing it that I knew immediately that was what I wanted to do with the rest of my writing career. I wanted to write that kind of whimsical, fantastical, innovative, imaginative stuff. And so when it got rejected, I was really destroyed, because that meant that if I wanted to continue as a writer, I had to go back to writing science fiction, and I had kind of lost my interest in regular science fiction. I didn't want to do that anymore.
Oh, well, I'm glad you found inspiration with Roger Rabbit.
Well, yeah, me too. I'm glad that somebody saw the light of day. Well, I'm glad that Disney saw the light of day, and Steve Spielberg, and the roughly 1 billion people who have seen the movie. Although I think there's still only about 15 people who have read the book, and I think 10 of those are my mother and my aunts. But interesting story about how the book became a movie too, because when I wrote the book, if you've read the book, and everybody should read the book.
I actually did. I've loved the movie my whole life, but it wasn't until I want to say 2013, 14, I actually did buy the book through digitally. Mm-hmm. I was curious, wow, this let's read the book, and it's a really good book. It's different, I will say that.
It's different, yeah, and it is the best book that at the time that I was capable of writing. I read it to appeal to a reader's imagination. When it was turned into a movie, it's all up there on the screen. When you read the book, you have to picture it in your mind. When it's up there on the screen, it's all up there on the screen. And they did a marvelous job of translating book to movie. They had to change the story, but they changed the story to make it more filmic. The book I never thought was really filmable. I didn't think there was any possible way you could take my book and make it into a movie, and I never wrote it with that in mind. I never, in my wildest imagination, never figured that was possible. So I sold the book in 1980, and because of publishing delays, it didn't come out until 1981. So it was mid-1980. The book had not come out yet. And I got a call at home on my home phone. And I pick it up, and the guy on the other end says, "Hey, is this Gary K. Wolf?" I said, "Yeah, it is." He said, "Well, hi, this is Roy Disney from the Disney Company." And I think, yeah, right, Roy Disney calling me at home on my home phone. That's choice. That's ever going to happen. I says, "Who is this really?" I figured it was one of my friends, having me on. And he said, No, it's really Roy Disney. And I read your book, and I wondered if you'd be interested in selling the rights to Disney and having us turn it into a movie. And I said, "Yeah, right, the book hasn't even come out yet. How did you read my book?" Well, it turned out that somebody at St. Martin's, and I never found out who, and I really tried, but somebody at St. Martin's sent a copy of the manuscript to Disney and said, "Hey, we think you'd really like this. This would be a perfect fit for Disney." And I really tried to find out who did that, because I wanted to kiss her or him full on the lips, but I never did. And the manuscript did work its way up eventually to Roy Disney, and they did, in fact, want to make this into a movie. They needed a project like Roger Rabbit, because at the time, this was 1980, Disney was a second-rate movie production house. So they were making movies like Flubber and The Nutty Professor and The Black Hole and The Black Cauldron, which disappeared down the black hole. They were making movies that were intended to be the bottom half of double features, and there were no more double features, so there was really no market for their movies anymore. They had been offered E.T. and they turned it down. They'd been offered Star Wars and they turned it down, and they had to make something that would propel them back into the forefront of movie production studios, and they saw Roger Rabbit as being that. They also had another motive. Their characters were getting a little old. I don't know if you've ever walked down any street in America or actually in the world and looked around, you will see that there are a lot of T-shirts, umbrellas, raincoats with Disney characters on them, lunch boxes. And, Disney makes a tremendous amount of money selling merchandise with their characters on it. Well, their characters were getting a little old and stale. They needed new characters. Mickey Mouse had become kind of the corporate spokesmouse. They couldn't have fun with him anymore. They had to be serious with him. You could have fun with Donald Duck, but nobody could understand what he said. So He was kind of out of it. And they saw Roger, Baby Herman, to some extent, Jessica, as characters that they could merchandise and kind of reinvigorate their merchandise line. So there was a lot of reasons for them to want and need this movie. And frankly, they offered me more for the movie rights than I'd made on everything I'd written before that put together. So, who am I to say no? I said, yeah, go ahead. I mean, if you guys think you can do it, go ahead, try. And for the first couple of years, they pretty much proved me right. They really didn't have the creative talent or horsepower to make the movie the way it should have been made. And admittedly, a lot of it was the technology involved. The technology to do this the way it finally wound up being done did not exist in 1980, 81, 82, 83. It did not exist. So they couldn't have done it at the level that it was eventually done. But they also had problems creatively with it. They couldn't get a good mix of animation and live action. And again, that was partially the technology. So at one point they came to me and said, hey, look, we're not having much luck with this live action animation thing. What would you say if instead of cartoon characters, we did this using costume characters like we do at Disneyland? Like real people in costumes. And I'm thinking, oh, Jesus, I'm going to have Fred McMurray as Eddie Valiant. I'm going to have Haley Mills as Jessica. And Dean Jones as the Rabbit. And Kurt Russell as Baby Herman. And I said, don't you think that compromises the concept just a little bit? And yeah, it probably does. So they went on and they kept spinning their wheels and probably would have spun their wheels forever. But in 1985, 5 years after they bought it, Roy Disney got forced out and Michael Eisner came in. And Mike brought with him Jeff Katzenberg, whom he'd worked with at, I think, Paramount. And they had done some pretty spectacular movies together. They threw out every project that Disney had going at the time because that's what got the previous regime into trouble. So the new regime always throws out everything except for Roger Rabbit. Mike and Jeff said, hey, this is the one movie we have to make. We have to make this movie. So they did something that nobody at Disney had ever done before. They brought in an outside producer to oversee the production of the movie. Nobody had ever done that. They'd always used internal people. And they brought in a guy that they both worked with before, a little-known guy at the time named Steve Spielberg. Right. So Steve Spielberg gets involved. And the minute Steve Spielberg gets involved, the wheels stop spinning. And it goes into four-wheel drive, and it just goes forward and doesn't stop. And it show you what a difference Steve Spielberg makes in Hollywood. In 1981 or 2, Roy Disney went to Warner Brothers and said, hey, we're making this live-action animated movie, and all of our Disney characters are going to be in it. We would like to have Bugs Bunny do a cameo. Bugs Bunny will come out on screen. He'll say, what's up, Doc? He'll say, I ate a stinker. He'll bite a carrot. And he's off. What do you think? And Warner Brothers looked at Roy Disney and said, what are you, nuts? Get out of here. There's no way. Forget about it. There's no way that a Warner Brothers character is ever going to be in a Walt Disney movie. That's just never going to happen. Get lost. So 5 years later, 1986, Steve Spielberg goes to Warner Brothers and makes essentially the same request. We'd like to use Bugs Bunny. Can we use Bugs Bunny for a cameo? And Warner Brothers looks at Steve Spielberg and says, of course, take him. What about Porky Pig? Don't you want him too? And how about Wile E. Coyote or the Roadrunner? And Sylvester and Tweety, and Yosemite Sam. Take them all. So Steve basically got all of the Warner Brothers characters. The only requirement was that Bugs Bunny, being a cartoon superstar, had a contract. And in his contract, it specified that he, being a co-equal superstar, with Mickey Mouse had to be at every scene with Mickey Mouse. You could not have Mickey Mouse in a scene alone without Bugs. And more than that, they had to have the same amount of words of dialogue. So if you go through and watch the movie, you'll see that every time Mickey appears on screen, Bugs is there with him. And if you count up their dialogue, they have the exact same number of words of dialogue. I'll give you an interesting little historical tidbit that I just found out. I didn't know this until just a couple of months ago. But the Warner Brothers people also specified that they wanted the characters to be the 1980 version of the Warner Brothers characters, which, especially in Bugs' case, considerable difference from the 40s, 50s version of the character. And the Disney artists were just vehemently opposed to that. They said it's graphically jarring and historically jarring. We want to use the 40s characters. So basically what they did was they did two versions. They did a version of animation with the 80s characters and then another version with the 40s characters. And they showed Warner Brothers the version with the 80s characters, and they put the version with the 40s characters in the movie. And it wasn't until the movie came out and Warner Brothers saw it that they realized that the characters were the 40s characters and not the 80s characters that they saw. But it wound up being incredibly fortuitous for them because the movie was such a smash success that they really couldn't complain. And they wound up getting a new merchandise stream because they started manufacturing dolls and raincoats, T-shirts, whatever, with the 40s characters as well as the 80s characters. So that was kind of interesting. I didn't find that out until a couple of months ago, and I found it out from the artist who did it. And I said, well, what happened to you after? Because he got the blame. They blamed it all on him, like he was the one who snuck in at night and changed all the characters from the 80s to the 40s. He got fired afterwards, but it was for a good cause. It was for a good cause. Viva la authenticity. So the movie, once Steve Spielberg got involved, he picked Bob Zemeckis to direct, and Bob Zemeckis and Steven had both read the book when it came out, and both were interested in doing the movie, but when they talked to Disney about it, neither one of them thought Disney had the horsepower back then to do it, so they went away. But when Michael Eisner came in and brought Jeff, threw a lot of resources at it, they both came back and said, hey, yeah, we'll do this movie.
Well, that's great. And so the credited screenwriters, I want to give them a shout out, were Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman. I'm curious, since you're the author, were you at all in contact with them? Did you have any consulting abilities in the movie? Did you get final say or anything?
In the early days, the screenplay that they did was there were tons of screenplays done. As you can imagine, from 1980 to 1985, they tried a whole lot of different approaches because they weren't having any luck with it. And the Siemens and Price screenplay was one of the first, possibly even the first, and they just really nailed it. In those days, they asked me if I wanted to write a screenplay, but in those days I wasn't writing screenplays, and it's a different technique entirely and a different skill set from being a novelist. It's just much different technique. So I said, no, I don't want to get involved with it. And sometimes they would show them to me, sometimes not. There was never any formal thing. They didn't have to. They kind of respected the fact that I was the one who came up with the character in the first place. And even though they wound up eventually changing the story from book to movie, even though they wound up changing the story, they kept the crucial elements that I created. They kept the characters. They kept Roger Rabbit. They kept Jessica Rabbit. They kept Eddie Valiant, Baby Herman. But more importantly, they kept the whole concept of cartoon characters living in a real world. I mean, that's my creation. And to me, that's the most important part of the book and the movie. You know, everything else is just something, it's just clothing to be hung on the rack. It's the concept that's the important thing. After Steve Spielberg and Bob Zemeckis got involved, they really respected, you know, my creativity and what I'd come up with. And they let me sit in as much or as little as I wanted. I would find myself sitting in a room with 35 of the most creative guys I've ever met in my life, and they were all throwing out ideas on how to make my story funnier. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, where were you guys when I was sitting at my kitchen table at 4 a.m. writing this thing in the first place? You know, if you'd have been there then, I'd had a Pulitzer Prize for literature. But you know, they let me go to as much of the filming as I wanted to. But I'm a novelist. You know, I'm not a movie maker. I'm a film buff. I love going to movies, but I find making movies to be the most horribly boring enterprise under the sun. You know, they would set up and do 50 takes. Chris Lloyd, I love Chris Lloyd, but he's you know, he's that guy from Taxi, Reverend Jim. He in the scene where he was playing Judge Doom and was going to snap that rubber glove on his hand, he just could not get that rubber glove to snap on right. He would snap it up and the wrong fingers would go in, the thumb wouldn't go in, or, you know, and so time after time they filmed him snapping the glove. And, you know, after maybe 50 times, he finally got the glove to snap, and and then they broke and set it up and did something else. And yeah, I'm a writer. I can't abide that kind of stuff. I'm more inclined to sit in my office all alone, thinking up things in my head, and that's what makes me happy. Watching people make a movie, even a movie based on my book, it doesn't do much for me. But that didn't stop me from going to the high points. I mean, they filmed the movie in London because Steve Spielberg likes the food there. You know, go figure. No, it's not really. No, it's not really. All the food was pretty good, but the reason he filmed in London was because they needed a sound stage that had 3 levels, because the set was on the top level, like the top floor. The second floor were the people who were manipulating the real props, and they were manipulating the real props through holes that were drilled and drawn in the floor above them. And then on the ground floor was a bank of video monitors where Bob Zemeckis would be, and he would be looking at what was being filmed on the top floor, and he had animators down there who were drawing over the screen so that he could see how the animation was working with the live action, because the animation hadn't been done yet. So they needed that kind of a sound stage, and that was Elstree Studios in London. That kind of soundstage didn't exist in the United States at the time. It does now, but it didn't then. So I filmed in London, and I mean, they treated me well. I flew over. My wife and I flew over, and they gave me a car and a driver, which I said, "Oh my God, you know, a car and a driver." I said, "What do you do?" He said, "Well, I take you anywhere you want." I said, "Well, you know, if I want to get a pizza, you take me to get a pizza?" He said, "Of course." I said, "Well, take me to Harrods, to the carriage entrance at Harrods." So they drove me and my wife to the carriage entrance at Harrods, and we got out at the carriage entrance at Harrods, and big department store, and I told my wife, I said, "You know, my regret here is that none of my friends are here to see this. I wish somebody was here to see this." But I went to that filming. I went to a lot of the filming at ILM where they did the special effects. I went to George Lucas's studio, ILM. I went to Skywalker Ranch to see the sound work being done. But it wasn't a full-time job for me. I mean, the movie took from 1985 to 1988, 3 years, and I went to someplace new that I thought would be fun, and I had fun being there, but it was not something that consumed my life and that I did every day. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's still great that you got to really be on set. So
yeah, and I'll tell you, you talk to so many writers who have had their books made into movies, and their experience. I've got easily the best experience I've ever heard from a writer whose book was made into a movie. A friend of mine had his book made into a movie, and it was a great book. It was an okay movie, but the movie was being filmed in London, just like mine was, and he wanted to go to the set, and so he said, "Can I come to the set and watch the filming of the movie?" And they said, "Sure. You've got to buy your own ticket and make your own hotel reservations, and pay all your own expenses." So he said, "Okay," and it was worth it to him. So he bought a ticket, made reservations, flew to England. He got there. He went to the studio, and they said, "Oh, we finished here 3 days ago. We're in California now. If you want to see the movie being filmed, you're going to have to fly from here to California, make your own reservations, and pay for your own ticket." When they had the premiere, he had to buy a ticket to get into see his own movie. That's the other end of the spectrum. I had none of that experience. Disney treated me really well, and of course they made a movie that far surpassed my expectations.
Yeah, because when you legendarily hear about authors like being upset that the final product is not their work.
Yeah.
Like, P.L. Travers, they made a whole movie about that, the making of Mary Poppins.
Oh, absolutely.
Stephen King, wasn't satisfied with The Shining. It goes on and on. But what I like about you is, like, you really are a fan of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, the movie. And is there anything at all that you felt was disappointing or you would change, or, like, even a small thing?
Well, I'll tell you. This is something I've thought about. Do I have any regrets about that movie? And I have one, and it's a big one. All right. Bob Hoskins was the most incredible actor that I have ever seen in my life. And I mean, I haven't seen a whole lot of actors, but during the movie I saw a bunch. Bob Hoskins, the work that he did in that movie was incredible. Bob Hoskins would sometimes stand on an empty stage and act, and he was making up everything in his mind. I mean, there was nothing there. And yet, when you see him and you see the finished movie, he makes you believe that rabbit is real, and he makes you believe that he's in Toontown, and he makes you believe that he's facing down weasels. I mean, he was unbelievable. He was incredible actor. When he was thrown out of the Ink and Paint Club by the gorilla, he was on a wire, of course, but at the end they dropped him so that he would get a real foam when he hit those trash cans. When they dropped him, he broke 3 ribs.
Wow.
So we said, "Oh God, that's going to be it for filming for a couple of months." He showed up the next day, all taped up. Said, "Yeah, I'm ready to go. Let's go." I mean, an unbelievable actor. And my only regret about the movie, is that he did not even get nominated for an Academy Award. He should have won the Academy Award for Roger Rabbit, hands down, because that was just an unbelievable job of acting. And I think what worked against him was he was so good at it that he made it look too easy. And people saw that and they said, "Well, yeah, I mean, great acting, but I don't remember who won it that year." I went to the Academy Awards that year, actually. Yeah, I sat.
It was like Dustin Hoffman or whatever.
Dustin Hoffman won it. Yeah, and I sat close enough to share to smell her perfume on that. The the movie won 4 Academy Awards, but Bob Hoskins was not even nominated. That's right. Dustin Hoffman won it for Rain Man.
Yeah, I mean, Tom Cruise was in the movie. Roger Rabbit was not in the movie. That's acting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we think Dustin Hoffman would have made it if Tom Cruise had been a talking rabbit. I don't know. Probably not. I don't know. I had nothing against Dustin Hoffman. But that's my one regret. There's not even a little. And I mean, I don't know how many times you've watched that movie, but I've watched it. I'm sure I'm creeping up on 750 times, and because a lot of my friends, my new friends, want to watch it with me. I've watched it at a lot of film festivals, and every time I watch it, I am left with a sense of wonder that it is so well done and that it still holds up. I mean, a movie is almost 35 years old, and it still holds up. I haven't watched Rain Man in a while, but I don't know if Rain Man is going to hold up as well as that. But Roger Rabbit is still a great movie. Smithsonian Institute just selected Roger Rabbit to be one of the movies that they designated as a national historical treasure, and it's up there with Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. I've looked at it so many times. I don't see a flaw. There's a lot of that. A lot of that is because we had rules of the world. The cartoon characters were allowed to do cartoon things. The humans were allowed to do human things, and you couldn't have a cartoon character doing a human thing or a human doing a cartoon thing. And that's something that I established in the book. I spent a lot of time formulating the rules of my world because I realized that when I was writing the book that if I violated those rules, I'd lose my reader. So everything had to be consistent. And the movie did the same thing. The cartoon characters are cartoon characters and do cartoon things, and the humans do human things. And there's only one violation in that, and that was something that Bob Zemeckis came up with, a little gag that he came up with that he thought would be really funny. And we pointed out to him, Bob, this violates the rules of the world. But he's the director, and he said, well, I'm going to do it anyway. And so there's only one violation, and it is in the elevator when Droopy is the elevator operator and says going down, boom, and he goes down, and at the bottom, Bob Hoskins is all scrunched up on the floor like a pancake. Well, yeah. That violates the basic rules of the world. But Bob Zemeckis thought it was funny, so it's in the movie. But that is such a minor point that I'm gonna cut him some slack, and I'll live with that.
Yeah, it's a funny gag. But
it's a funny gag. Yeah, it's a funny gag.
But yeah, so you mentioned so many the cool people you've got to work with involved with the movie. You mentioned it yourself. It's almost been 35 years. Have you kept in contact or even run into anybody that you from involved with that movie that
Yeah. Like I say, I'm a writer. I'm not a movie guy. I live in Boston. I don't hang out in Hollywood, and most movie people do hang out in Hollywood. Sure, I've when they did Toontown, they opened Toontown in Disneyland in I think 1999, maybe, I don't know. Bob Zemeckis was there, Spielberg was there. I can't remember if Kathleen Turner, the voice of Jessica, was there or not. I read Charlie Fleischer and I have become really good friends. I've seen him scores of times, and we communicate all the time. In fact, I'm working on a project now that I don't think I can't talk about it, but Charlie will be involved. And Bob Hoskins and I got to be really close. I mean, Bob, toward the end of the movie, told me that he saw the rabbit. I mean, the rabbit was real to him. And it took him 6 months until the rabbit vanished. He can no longer see the rabbit. He saw the rabbit. and we got to be really good friends. He and I hung out when he came to Boston to film Mermaids, and I got to know him pretty well. But it's not like you work with these people, and they're creative people, and they're talented people, and Bob Hoskins was my Eddie Valiant. Charlie Fleischer was the voice of my Roger Rabbit. But it's not like you hang out with them every day. I mean, you don't invite them over for a backyard barbecue. First of all, they're on one coast and I'm on the other. But yeah, I do see them. I've done autographings with Kathleen, wonderful woman. Interesting, when Kathleen did the voice of Jessica, she did it uncredited because at the time nobody really knew if this movie was going to be any good. I mean, they didn't know if this movie was going to be. They didn't even know if this movie was going to be for adults or for children. They just didn't know. They didn't know if it was going to be a good movie or Howard the Duck. So Kathleen agreed to do the voice of Jessica without credit. And the voices were done first. They were done early on. Because this is what James Earl Jones did with Darth Vader. Nobody knew if that was going to be any good either. So he did the voice of Darth Vader uncredited. And if it was good, then he would step forward and say, "Hey, I was the voice." And if it was terrible, he would just slink into the background. So she did the voice uncredited. But when it came time to sing the song, for whatever reason, she couldn't sing the song. And she was pregnant at the time, so maybe she didn't have the breath control. I don't know. Maybe she just can't sing. I don't know. But Steve Spielberg was there with his wife at the time, who was Amy Irving. And so Steve said, "Hey, Amy, you sang in Yentl. Why don't you give it a whack?" And so she did, and she sang the song. And I said to Steve, nobody's going to believe that Jessica has one voice when she sings and another voice when she speaks. He said, nobody will notice. And nobody ever did. But Amy Irving took screen credit. So if you read the credits, and the credits are probably as long as some early movies. I mean, if you read the credits, you will see singing voice of Jessica Rabbit, Amy Irving. That's kind of my experience with Hollywood people. I'm on the East Coast. Whenever they come to the East Coast, yeah, we get together. But it's not like an everyday thing, no.
Yeah, well, before we do wrap up, I do want to mention, Roger Rabbit is maybe the greatest, most successful movie to never get a sequel. But you, on the other hand, while we're still waiting for Disney to make a sequel, you have written not one but two sequels. So you want to talk about how that came involved? Because
oh, sure.
In the book,
yeah,
Roger
sure.
Rabbit
I really had no intention of ever revisiting Roger Rabbit. That was going to be a one-off book for me. I was going to go on and do something else. But because of the success of the movie, publishers were coming to me and begging me for a sequel. And I finally said, okay, I'll write a sequel. But it was a problem because the movie was kind of a little different thematically than the book. The
Very
book was
different continuity.
The book was darker. The movie was, not family friendly. It's not a kids movie, but it wasn't quite as dark as the book. And one of the main differences is that in the book, these were comic strip and comic book characters, so they didn't speak with words; they spoke with word balloons. So if a cartoon character speaks, he puts up a word balloon, and you don't listen to him; you read him. And if he turns around, then his word balloon turns around, and you have to run to the other side of him to read it, or you have to learn to read in reverse. And a cartoon character can create a word balloon and hit you with it. And I just had a lot of fun playing with that convention. And of course, that was something that could not be done in the movie. I mean, they tried to do that in the movie early on, but it became a silent movie. A cartoon character would put up a word balloon, and the whole action would stop, and they would read the word balloon and go on. So that obviously wasn't going to happen. In a deleted scene, Marvin Acme's funeral, a scene deleted from the movie, they had Crazy Cat, who was a comic strip and cartoon character from I think the 30s and 40s, and Crazy Cat never spoke. He was always silent. And they had Crazy Cat in the crowd, or maybe one of the pallbearers, I can't remember. But they were carrying Marvin Acme's casket, and Crazy Cat, as an homage to me, put up a word balloon that said sob. And it turned to tears and got his shoulders, head all wet. It was just beautiful animation. But that whole scene got cut, and so did my homage. But you know, when I wrote the second novel, I didn't want to Disneyfy it. I didn't want to make it a Disney movie. I didn't want to make it as kind of wholesome as a Disney product would normally be. So it's still got a cutting edge to it. It's still biting, and it's still got adult themes. And the characters in the second movie, in the second book, the characters have the option. They can speak with word balloons, or they can speak verbally. It's easier for them to speak with word balloons, but they can speak verbally if they want to. The third novel was kind of interesting because I had actually outlined it after the first novel was written, and I forgot about it. It was in one of my bureau drawers, and I totally forgot that I had written it. Instead, I wrote Who Censored Roger Rabbit, which was the first. Then I wrote Who Plugged Roger Rabbit, in which we standardized on the 4-piece stutter. That was the second. But I had actually written Who Whacked Roger Rabbit, which was the third, before Who Plugged. And so thematically, it's closer to the first one than to the second one. And years after I wrote Who Plugged, I was publishing some other books, and my publisher said, well, hey, how about doing a blog? Can you do a blog, and we'll get people to come to your blog? And I said, sure, I'll do that. And they said, well, maybe you could do something to get them interested in it, like maybe a short story or something. I said, I've got this Roger Rabbit novel. I said I could put a chapter a week on my blog. And they said, you've got a Roger Rabbit novel that you've never published? I said, yeah, it's been in my desk drawer for like 20 years. And so it came out, and I did a little buffing to it, made it consistent, and published the third one, which was basically written before the second one. They have now, incidentally, when the second one came out, the sequel, I had 10 publishers bidding for the rights to publish that novel. All 10 of those publishers had rejected the first novel once. 3 of them had rejected the first novel twice, and one lucky devil had rejected the first novel 3 times. So there is justice in the world. Actually, I just finished a fourth, which is a Jessica Rabbit novel, and it's a Jessica Rabbit origin story. It talks about how she started out as a poor working class shop girl, and went from there to become Jessica Rabbit. Talks about how she met Roger, how Roger came to be, and where Toontown came from. So it's an origin story, and that was done. I'm waiting for a couple of things. I have to find the right publisher for that, and in the meantime, I've started another Roger Rabbit novel, which is more hard-boiled private eye. It goes back to the original. It's Eddie Valiant, hard-boiled noir private eye novel. So there's still plenty more coming. Stay tuned, as we say. And talking about the sequel, stay tuned. Who knows? In Hollywood, you can never tell.
Can never tell. Hopefully, someone Disney will be knocking on your door.
Well, hopefully. I'll tell you one last story about going to the premiere. All right, when I went to the premiere, they had the premiere at Radio City Music Hall in New York City, so that I wouldn't have to come to California, from Boston. I could just take the train to New York City, which I did. And so I found myself in Radio City Music Hall, and I was up in the VIP section, which was the first balcony, and I had Kathleen Turner sitting on my left and Amy Irving sitting on my right. I mean, two of the most beautiful women I've ever met in my life. And I'm about to see my movie all the way through for the first time, and I'd never seen it all the way through. I'd seen bits and pieces, but I'd never seen it all the way through put together. And I was going to see my credit on the screen for the first time, which I'd also never seen. And I thought to myself, life doesn't get any better than this. And then, by golly, life got better, because Kathleen put her hand on my leg, and she leaned in and she whispered in my ear, "Gary, are you excited?" Kathleen, you have no idea. So the movie went on to win 4 Academy Awards. Was the top grossing movie of the year at $750 million. It's since grossed well over $1 billion. Gave rise to themed lands, Toontown, Disneyland, scores and scores and scores of merchandise. So it did everything that Disney wanted that movie to do. Very successful in all respects, creatively, artistically, and financially.
Well, sounds great. Well, Gary, I just want to say, as I wrap this up, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been a real honor.
Yeah.
Talking to you.
And shameless plug, visit my website, www.garywolf.com, and you will be able to buy all of the merchandise that we have talked about ad infinitum here, and you'll be able to find out all about me and my history.
Absolutely, do that. Thanks, Gary.
Sure, my pleasure.